It's so nice to see familiar faces. Some of you I know from Headington Baptist Church or other places. I guess we've been around Oxford long enough. Lynette and I have been involved in Northway Church for the last 7 years, although we were seconded there from HBC. We're back at HBC now because we're moving from Oxford to go to Bath, although I don't know when exactly that will be. Just to put myself and the message in context a little bit, Lynette and I work for an agency called Friends International, which some of you may be aware of, and we work with international students, and our role is, so Lynette is head of learning and development, so she does all the conferences and the training of staff and volunteers, and I'm basically an evangelist and Bible teacher for international students around the UK. And I don't know how, put your hand up if you've read a book that has been published since lockdown began. One or two. I've come across loads, and I have to say I've joined the club. I've also, a bit of shameless advertising here. I have actually, I wrote a book at the beginning of lockdown, partly because I finally got the time to actually write it. It's called Is Christianity a Western Religion and Other Questions That International Students Ask, and it's designed really as a kind of resource or something to give to students who come from lots of different cultures, and it's basically, each chapter is hopefully the answer to one of 20 questions which have been most commonly asked over the last 20, 30 years. The reason I mention that, by the way, I've brought 2 copies along. So, so for you, it's £5 for one, or both for £10. But obviously, one of those questions which comes up very often is the question of suffering. And you may think, well, why write a book with a specific answer? But the reason for it is that we may have the same questions, but depending on our culture and our religious background and our experience, often what we're looking for in an answer is different. And I want to just repeat this verse that, partly because there's a slight change in translation here, but the 2011 version of the NIV, in verse 18, which is the scripture I was given for today, is, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in or by the Spirit. For Christ also suffered for sins." Now, some years ago, when we were, before we went to Northway, when we were at HPC, a guy started coming along to Headington Baptist Church who had quite a lot of troubles, a lot of life-controlling issues, drugs and alcohol, poverty and so on. And we tried to help him. People were very kind to him in the church, but he wasn't an easy guy. And one day he voiced his complaints to my wife, Lynette. He said, "You Christians," he said, "you don't know what life is all about." He said, "You live your comfortable middle-class lifestyles and you have no problems and you just cruise through life. You don't know what suffering is." Oh boy, did he pick the wrong person to say that to. So as Lynette very politely told him that her sister had actually been in a coma for several years, following a failed operation to remove a brain tumor, she has since passed away. And out of our 3 children, 2 of them have inherited my bone condition, and our son has learning difficulties, and so on. As she started to list these things, he had the grace to actually shut up. But it seems to me, as I work with students around the country from different cultures, but particularly when Western students talk to me, it seems that the attitude that many people have is that we've never thought about the question of suffering. As if it has never really occurred to us that actually suffering exists. It's almost like the ACE card, like, but what about suffering? As if we've never thought about it before. As if the Bible hasn't sought to address it. Which, of course, it has. But although some people seem to think that they can wave the suffering card at us and say, but you never thought of that, the answer to the question of suffering is not easy to explain, nor should it be treated lightly with a clever rebuttal. The question of suffering is huge, is often intensely personal, and should never be treated lightly. But why am I talking about suffering? I was given this verse 18, and the brief was really to talk about the gospel. But what I'm hoping to do is I'm not going to preach through the whole passage, but I want us to see how suffering and the gospel are very much part of the same picture. At Word Alive this year at Easter, we were actually looking at 1 Peter. This isn't a cut and paste sermon. Actually, this is a fresh sermon from that. But the Apostle Peter was writing to a group of people who were suffering a whole range of different kinds of trials and difficulties over a wide geographical area in what we now know as Turkey. But what Peter seems to have in mind primarily is not the day-to-day suffering which we all go through, but another level of suffering because we are believers in Jesus. And as we were talking with the students this year and saying, why is it that Christians should suffer for their faith? And we said that actually it's because an exchange has taken place. That we did belong to the world, but we were strangers to God. Not that he didn't know us, but we didn't know him. But now that we have believed in Jesus, that we belong to the family of God, we're part of his kingdom, but we are now strangers to the world. But let's back up a little bit, because so often we forget this, but the question of suffering is not unique to the Christian faith. Every single religion and philosophy and worldview must address the question as to why there is so much suffering in the world. And yet the reason why Christianity seems to come uniquely under fire is precisely and only because we believe in a God of love. If you take the God of love out of the picture, then suffering becomes much easier to explain. So, for example, when I was a materialistic atheist a long time ago now, I would have said, if I had heard of Richard Dawkins, I hadn't, but if I had, I probably would have quoted him as saying something along the lines of, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. Easy to say when you're not the one living in a refugee camp in Darfur. Islam, on the other hand, relegates the idea of suffering to the supreme sovereignty of God, inshallah, as God wills. Because God's power and authority as the king is the top of Allah's list of attributes, and love is somewhere down the scale. So the question of suffering is relegated to, well, ours is not to reason why, it is our duty to submit to the supremacy of Allah. Other religions and philosophies describe life in terms of karma, such as the student who once told me that she believed in the law of cause and effect. I didn't know what she meant, and she was a new Christian, but I kind of thought, it's not quite from the Bible, what are you talking about? And she said, well, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And I finally realized she was actually she was superimposing her Christianity onto a Buddhist worldview. But I did actually point out that sometimes bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. But in the law of karma, that works out in subsequent lives, in reincarnation. So you end up paying for things in the next life, even if you don't in this life. Which leaves people like our friend who was a student at Brooks. She's gone back to Southeast Asia now. Her mum is a Christian, but her dad is a Hindu. She has a form of dwarfism. She's about this high. And her Hindu side of the family, and I say this with respect, despise her because they fear her. They think it is her fault that she was born this way, that she must have done something very bad in a previous incarnation. And so even though it doesn't matter that she can't remember what she was supposed to have done, they quite literally treat her as a curse on the family because they're afraid of her bad karma infecting them. And we're trying very hard to tell her that she's precious in the sight of God, that God has made her beautiful in his sight. But the weight of what she suffers from that worldview makes her own suffering many times worse. However we explain the existence of suffering, the absence of a God of love makes it easier to explain, perhaps, but then we have to do without hope. We can't have it both ways. An ancient philosopher, I think it was Epicurus, said that three things cannot exist together. That God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, and suffering exists. He says those three things, only two of those things can actually be true at any one time. And he said this, because we know suffering exists, then either God is all-loving but he's not all-powerful, so he wants to help us but can't, or God, worse, God is all-powerful but he's not all-loving, so he can help us but he won't. And for many people, that's the clinching argument, the end of the discussion. A God of love can't exist. But what Epicurus didn't know, and what many people don't realize, is that there is a fourth factor. That God is all-powerful. That God is all-loving. That yes, suffering exists, but God suffers. God suffers. And that's exactly where verse 18 brings us to. For Christ, the Son of God, God himself also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. So let's make it abundantly clear then that when we say we believe in a God of love, we don't mean that God is somewhere up there kind of looking down, smiling and having nice warm thoughts towards us. Our God got involved. And it's interesting to see that in the Old Testament we have books like the book of Job that talk about suffering from a kind of conceptual view and it debates that. But when it comes to the New Testament, it's almost a non-issue. Why? Because the righteous of the New Testament had seen with their very eyes the God who suffered. But why did God suffer? Why did Jesus suffer? Well, again, let's look at that verse. It says, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit. So some of the things that I sometimes say to students, especially in a talk about do all religions lead to God, I might say something like, in many religions of the world, maybe most religions, it goes a lot like this. It says, these are the good things that we must do, and these are the bad things that we must avoid. And we must make sure that our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds. And when we get to the end of our lives, it'll somehow be weighed up. And if we've done more good than bad, we will be rewarded. And if we've done more bad than good, we will somehow reap the consequences. And that makes some level of sense to many people. But first of all, it assumes that knowing God and being connected to God is not possible in this life, which we know is not true. But also, who tells you when good is good enough? Who tells you when you've arrived? It's like trying to run a race where nobody tells you how far away the finishing line is or even which direction to run. To live without knowing when and if or God will ever accept us is kind of the definition of living without hope. Let me share with you two little stories that I often use to explain the gospel, particularly in a cross-cultural setting. If it's useful to you, please, there's no copyright on it, please do use it. Talking to students about debt is quite easy. I don't know if you've ever been in debt. I don't suppose if you're going to get in debt, then please talk to Gordon and Liz about that later. Are you still involved with you are, right? I'm just checking that. But I got once into really terrible debt. I was in way over my head. I was 9 years old. So I was in the woods near my home playing with some friends, and one of them had a big kind of army truck toy, and I loved it. And he said, well, if you like it so much, then I'll sell it to you for £5. This is quite a long time ago, so £5 was quite a lot of money. I said, I don't have £5. He said, that's okay, you can pay me back. So I brought this thing home, and I thought, wow, that was easy. So I went to another friend's house, and I saw something that I liked, and I said, I'll buy that off you for £5, I'll pay you back. And my friend said, sure. I did it 3 times in the space of 2 weeks. And I suddenly, well, I think I was a very strange child, and I suddenly found myself in debt by £15, £5 to each of 3 boys. Now, I could get money by washing Dad's car, and he paid me 50 pence a time. And it slowly dawned on my 9-year-old brain that I would have to wash my dad's car 30 times in order to pay back this impossible debt, this 3 stupid mistakes, and I was already in over my head. And I felt like a huge weight was pressing down on me. I felt trapped. I didn't know it was possible to have a way out. Then Mum found out. I don't know how when Mum found out, but I think mums have a radar for the trouble their kids get into. And she said, gosh, Peter, how much do you owe? I said, £15, £5 to each of these 3 boys. She said, right, get in the car. So I immediately got in the car, and she drove me to each of these 3 boys' houses. She made me stay in the car while she herself went to the door, explained, and then paid back the £5 in each case. I later discovered that £15 was my mum's personal money for an entire month. So Dad budgeted some for Mum to run the household, and after all the bills were paid for and everything, £15 was her money for herself for a whole month, and she used that to get me out of trouble. And then she got back in the car and she said to me, Peter, doesn't it feel horrible to be in debt? Yes, Mum, it does. She said, I have paid your debt. Now, don't do that again. And I felt free. I felt that this weight had come off me, and I knew that Mum didn't then want me, she didn't want to extract her pound of flesh from me. She was setting me free. What she was looking for was a change of behavior. And she got it. And really, that is what Jesus has done for us in a much, much, much greater way. He has found us, and through our stupid mistakes and our terrible things that we do and think and say, and we've got ourselves way in over our head, but he has stepped in, and through his death on the cross, he has set us free by paying our debt. And said, I'm looking for a change of behavior. And because he has set us free, we are free to begin again. The righteous for the unrighteous to bring us to God. The other example I sometimes use, particularly with East Asian students, is when we go to visit our Korean friends for dinner, we must take our shoes off at the door. It's true in many cultures, but in Korean culture particularly, you cannot go into their house with your shoes on. It doesn't matter even if they're brand new, they've still got the price labels attached. We cannot go into their house with outdoor shoes on, or it will be really insulting to them. It doesn't matter if I say, my wife's shoes are dirtier than mine, can I come in? Because it would be insulting. I must take my shoes off at the door, but what they do is they supply us with slippers, clean indoor slippers to wear inside their house. They are never big enough for me, but I know that this is what they have provided. And I have to be willing to look down at my shoes and go, they're never going to be clean enough. But if I'm willing to take them off and accept the slippers that they give me, then I can come in and enjoy their friendship and their fellowship. So often we look at our own lives and we think that we hope that we're good enough. Or we look at other people and say, well, we're doing better than they are. But God is a holy God, and we can never come into fellowship with him by trusting in our own goodness, by thinking that we're ever going to be good enough or clean enough. But that verse says, to bring us to God. He wants us to have fellowship with him. And so what we need to do is to look at our own lives and realize that we're never going to be good enough, never going to be clean enough, and stop relying on our own goodness. In other words, take our shoes off. And to step into the life of Jesus by accepting him through faith, realizing that he was the only one who was good enough. And when we do that, we can come in and be part of God's family forever. The righteous for the unrighteous to bring us to God. God's kindness and his love prevents him from dealing with all suffering right now. Let me say it again. God's kindness and love prevents him from dealing with all suffering in the world right now. Now, verse 18 is our text, but if you look at verse 19, it's one of the hardest verses in the New Testament to understand. And quite literally, I don't know anybody who does understand it. And so if I say, can we slip back past verse 19 to go to verse 20? I'm not cheating, okay? And when I said this to a group of maybe about 100 East Asian students, they were quite happy with that, because many cultures see it as wise to accept that you can't explain everything, that there is ambiguity. I can't explain verse 19, but we can look at verse 20 onwards and start to understand what Peter was getting at. Now, when I was writing my chapter on suffering, I explained that the reality is that if God were to remove anything and everything in this life that causes suffering, he would have to remove me and you. Because theologically but even in practice, even if you don't accept Genesis chapter 3, most suffering in the world comes from human beings directly or indirectly. Even the way we use resources on this side of the world affects people on the other side of the world. Even those situations which are much more to do with, say, natural disasters are made many times worse because of greed and selfishness and corruption and a poor distribution of resources. But I was thinking that if God were to remove everything on earth that causes suffering, he would have to remove me and you and all human beings. And then it dawned on me, he's already done that. He already did that once, and that is actually the story of Noah and the great flood. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of it, and Noah and the flood is mystery and history together. But the point of it is simple, that God was so grieved with us as human beings, that we were so evil and causing relentless suffering on each other, that God, the God of love, had no choice but to make an end to that situation, to make an end to those people. But Peter is explaining here that is not the whole story, because the story is of Noah, of one family who escaped that judgment, who took God's offer of a way out. And verse 20 says that God was patient. I don't know how long it took. Was it 100 years to build the ark? And all the time the ark was being built, everyone had a chance to respond to the grace and kindness of God. But no one did except Noah's family. And the point that Peter is making here is firstly that suffering is caused by humans. Secondly, the solution to suffering is to fundamentally end the cause of suffering, which is the end of sinful human life on earth. But see, as God is a God of love, he doesn't wish to do this, and so offers a solution, an escape for those who have the willingness and the faith to take it. Now, in the days of Noah, the rescue plan was a wooden boat. Now, the rescue plan is a wooden cross. Because, back then and now, the reason why God allows suffering to continue, whether 100 years or 1,000 years, is because he wants as many people as possible to have every opportunity to hear and understand that there is a rescue plan, the cross of Christ. Now, Peter said in his second letter, 2 Peter 3, verse 8, he says, "But do not forget one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Therefore, hard as it may seem to understand, and as inadequately as I can explain it here today, these verses tell us that the present existence of suffering is a consequence, at least in part, of the long-term, eternal love of God. Therefore, we have hope. We can opt, if we want to believe the world is created by pure chance, governed known by blind, pitiless indifference. But then we have to live in a world of blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, a life without hope. We can opt to believe in a universe governed by the laws of karma, the balance of all things. But again, we do so at the cost of hope. We could opt for faith in a distant deity or an all-encompassing sense of fate that absolves us of the burden of thinking through and wrestling with this idea of suffering, but we do so at the cost of hope. Now, if you have ever been on to a seminar on apologetics, answering difficult questions, 1 Peter 3 verse 15 is probably going to be quoted somewhere. Let me read it. In your hearts revere Christ as the Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. But actually, I don't think that Peter has in mind questions like, so what about evolution? Or is the Bible reliable, and do the ancient documents attest to its reliability? Actually, I don't think that was on Peter's mind at all. What I do think was on his mind was ordinary people living ordinary Christian lives who were answering questions like, why are you so happy? Why are you so happy when you suffer so much? Why are you not afraid of death like everyone else is? Why don't you worry about the future? And the answer is, we know we are loved. We know we are loved. We're not afraid that we won't make it and the doors of heaven will be shut on our faith, because we know we are loved. We know that our shame and our guilt has been taken away, and we can spend an eternity with God. Whatever happens in this world, we know that nothing can separate us from the love of God. How do we know that? How can we be so sure? Because the writer Peter had seen God suffer. He had seen Jesus put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. He was speaking as an eyewitness. So we have a choice. We can either believe and trust that God is love, or we can live without hope. There is no in between. You may have noticed that the Christian life is not a bed of roses. It is not a middle-class hobby. God's family is free to join, but will cost you your life. Have you responded to God's rescue plan yet? Or like me going to my friend's house, are you standing in the door hoping to be able to come in, but still thinking or worrying about whether you're good enough? Secondly, do not think that any amount of suffering in this world ever suggests for a moment that God doesn't love us. Quite just not true. In every other view of God, then it does suggest that God doesn't love us, but not in Christianity, because we follow the God who suffers. And finally, Peter was an eyewitness of Jesus' death and resurrection. But he writes to ordinary people like you and me who have not seen Jesus in the flesh. But in 1 Peter 1 verse 8, he says to you and me, though you have not seen him, Jesus, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. Let me pray. First of all, Father, I want to pray for any of us here who are suffering, whether through difficulties in the family or health or internal or external troubles. I pray, Father, that you would help us to look to you, the God who suffers, and know that you have everything under control, and that our suffering does not push you away from us or us away from you, but you are with us even in that. I pray for those of us perhaps who have not yet responded or only half responded to the offer of rescue. May we be clear in our decision now to stop trusting in our own goodness and to receive Jesus wholeheartedly. But to all of us, Lord, I pray that we would look to the reality and the truth of Jesus and his death on the cross and his resurrection, and know that through Jesus we can believe and love him, to love you, and to be filled now and for eternity with an inexpressible and glorious joy. Amen.